Welcome to the Mystery College Podcast. Today we're interviewing Eric Putkonen, and he is an expert in the topics of non-duality, enlightenment, awakening, self-inquiry, amongst other things. And he has a wonderful YouTube channel where he discusses everything to do with non-duality and doing so in the most simplified way possible. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I'd love to know, can you share more about the a moment of awakening in 2005 that you've had or you've mentioned?
Yeah. Well, it was, after, it was 13 odd years of spiritual seeking. It got to the point where I thought I had read it. It seemed like every book I had read seemed to be just kind of a revision of something I'd already read. And so after about 13 years, got kind of fed up with it and saw the futility of it and gave up seeking. And then a couple of years later, that's when awakening happened. The particulars, it's nothing like anything particularly caused it. I had kept hearing the name Eckhart Tolle popping up. I had been in spirituality long enough to know about synchronicities. So after hearing his name a half a dozen times in that same week, I figured, well, I should follow up and learn something about the guy. And so I ended up getting a video that I found in the library. I took out of a library called The Flowering of Human Consciousness. And much of it was stuff I'd heard before. But he presented being present very, I think, more kinesthetically, more experientially. And so in playing with that, I got very, very present. And the mind just died down. Now, not the first time I've ever been totally present. Everybody experiences moments where the mind dies down and they're totally present. And so I don't want to say, yes, it was this video and this being present was the cause of it. It just created a very conducive environment. So once again, the mind was present, very, very silent. And at that moment, it was like things, it was kind of like a veil dropped away. It was like things suddenly clicked. And there was a realization that was non-dual in nature. Didn't know it was non-dual in nature, hadn't studied anything about non-duality at that point. But during the video, Eckhart also mentioned Ramana Maharshi. And so I went over and I got a book on Ramana Maharshi, and I was reading his book as he was describing enlightenment, and I was like, yeah, that's what happened. And so, I realized it was non-dual nature because he was talking from a non-dual perspective. And so that was kind of it in a nutshell. It was just I was present, not thinking, and the time was right, so to speak. So it just kind of happened of itself at that time.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And how's it having been deeply influenced by Ramana Maharshi and Eckhart Tolle and others? Can you discuss some particular profound parts of that teaching that may have profoundly impacted your understanding or your coming into the perception and the beingness, the totality of non-duality?
Well, I would say the realization in 2005 pretty much gave me my own understanding of that. I would say reading all the stuff, which I did read some, because from Ramana Maharshi, I moved on to Nisargadatta Maharaj and Ramesh Balsekar and H.W. Punja and Gangaji, basically old to new, various teachers. And it gave me the vernacular and terminology to talk about it, but that was about it. It was able to conceptualize that which was realized on a non-conceptual level. And so, I think that, there's a lot of really good teachers and writers out there. Eckhart Tolle is spectacular in terms of being present. I liked Suzuki in terms of Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, also an excellent book. Ramana Maharshi, ever laser focused on who am I and not letting people wiggle out of that. And so that kind of did, I think, influenced a bit on how I talk about it and present it. Because, as I was reading things like Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, the whole idea of a beginner's mind made total sense to me. I'm like, yeah, that's exactly kind of what it's like, is you're dropping off all the past and you're seeing things new. Because you don't have that chattering mind constantly labeling, judging, pulling past experiences into the present. It's more or less of just looking at what is and seeing it as it is without all the reference. And so all these books kind of, I think, shape the way I talk about it. So when I talk about it, it's kind of a combination of probably Ramana Maharshi as being the biggest contributor, but also bits of old Zen Buddhist masters and a little bit of the Advaita Vedanta. So it's kind of a mix, I guess.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And you were talking about a bit earlier about like being able to talk about some of these topics, some of which are a little complicated, but instead like in a more down to earth, kind of straightforward style. So what are some ways that you maintain this approach in this space of being in non-duality and communicating and discussing these topics such as enlightenment, non-duality, especially with some folks who may have not had too many satori moments or moments where they had complete silence? How do you communicate that?
Well, I first of all, I try to, when you have a YouTube channel, you're going to deviate and wander a bit because you need stuff to keep talking about. It's not like you can spend the entire channel talking about meditation and self-inquiry and that's it. People are going to go, well, there's nothing new, and they'll leave. So, I'm usually looking for some fine point to clarify or work on. But at the same time, I'm trying to reduce it to as simple and practical measures as possible. Because it's not particularly complex. We make it very complex. once we grasp onto it mentally and we start contemplating it and rehashing it and trying to get it mentally, we turn that which is actually fundamentally very simple into something very complex. In Advaita Vedanta terms, they'll talk about Brahman. Brahman's just kind of ultimate reality. Could be self, could be consciousness. These are all equivalent terms. But, the basic tenet of Advaita Vedanta is Brahman alone exists. There is no other. There's nothing else there. And it really all comes down to that simplicity. And the problem is when you start talking about it, it starts creating this, you start delving more into the illusion of duality because some of the classic, Hindu teachings and stuff, we'll get into Jiva and these different forms of Brahman, and that comes about because you're trying to distinguish and talk about certain aspects of reality, but then because it goes to people that do not have the fundamental direct experience, they start taking it on belief that there are these various levels of reality and there's somewhere else, and it turns into this complex mess. And so I try not to go that route as best as possible. I try to keep it simple. I try to keep it practical. I say, pretty much when it comes to enlightenment, there's only two things you can do. You can be still, silent, fully aware, not thinking. This would also be called being present, mindful, meditation. It's all more or less the same flavor. And the other thing you can do when you feel you just can't do nothing anymore and you got to do something, if you feel you must do something, the only other thing you can do is look at this me that you feel and think yourself to be and question it. Take a good look at it. Am I really that? And if you see the false is false, you realize, oh, I'm not this. Well, then you're able to perhaps see past that prior misidentification and see what you really are. And so I've kind of boiled down everything to that. And so when people talk about all these other teachings, and like, well, what about the practice of detachment? I'm like, well, you can practice detachment. Non-attachment is more of a natural state that happens after awakening enlightenment. And so people kind of there is a belief that if you imitate or copy this as best as you're able, you too might become awakened. But it won't cause it. No matter how detached you try to become, it's not going to cause it to happen, but it does create a more conducive environment. Why? Because it minimizes or reduces the sense of me. It's, detachment is a practice of removing my and mine from the equation. You're giving up the concept of my and mind. Not mind, my and mine. And so, that kind of diminishes the me. So most practices, I can usually say it fits in one of those two categories that I gave. And in this way, I don't know, it's maybe just part of my personal makeup. I like reducing things into simple ways. My wife was actually rather intrigued by something I showed her once, where it was the culmination of, I was studying all these world religions, and I was like, okay, what does it all come down to? What is the essence of all of this? And in the end, I came down to, it's the way of love, truth, harmony, and unity. That's it. All religions, to some degree, some focus more on certain aspects than others, but it comes down to truth, love, unity, and harmony. And none of these are really able to be resolved into each other. Love is not exactly the same as truth, which isn't exactly the same as harmony, which isn't quite the same as unity, although unity bridges into harmony a little bit, I guess. But they don't really, they're not able to be boiled down any more than that. And I think that's what kind of keeps what I talk about simple, because I'm always trying to boil it down to its essence, going, how simple can I make this? I guess also to a certain extent, a somewhat lazy nature in terms of how little can I do when it comes to practice. How little do I got to do to get to the essence? And so it's kind of an interesting, I guess, aspect of the personality of this body mind, that it wants to go very, very practical, very, very simple. And so that just kind of becomes manifest in the way I talk about these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes me wonder about the culmination of the practice. Like, so like if we have a pot of water and we need to get a flame to it, like what is that flame that helps the water then come to a boiling point? Like that boiling point being that point where you can reach no mind or stay in no mind or have that awakening a moment. And how do those practices accumulate over time, or what is like a practice or practices, types of inquiries people can do to culminate to that point where they can come to awakening, so that space is held?
Yeah, I usually don't talk about it in terms of something like boiling water, because you can cause water to boil. You apply heat, it will boil. Unfortunately, there is fundamentally nothing you can do for the illusion of me to shatter. The fundamental, everything the me does will reinforce in some way that there is a me in the first place. And so practices for me are a way to set a more conducive environment. But it's one of those, I forget what they call it. It's a curve that will go down steeply and then flatten out as it approaches zero. And it never reaches zero. It just stays above zero for infinity. And practices are that for me. It will never bridge the gap to zero. You can never get to that awakening through the practices. But you can get a more conducive environment. I put in terms of trying to fall asleep at night. If you want to fall asleep at night, what do? Well, you go into a dark and quiet room and get comfortable. Does a dark and quiet room or getting comfortable cause sleep? No. Any insomniac can tell you that. Matter of fact, if you go into a dark and quiet room and try to get comfortable, and you have the dire need to fall asleep, and it's vitally important, so you try to make yourself fall asleep, the very fact of wanting to fall asleep so bad and trying to fall asleep tends to keep you awake. And so, is it possible to fall asleep without those circumstances? Well, yes, you could be sitting in the sun and fall asleep. And so a dark and quiet room is even required. And so that's where you get these questions where, is meditation required? No, it's not required, but it may help. It can create a conducive environment. So I don't want to ever say none of the practices have no value. I just think that you're going to be disappointed if you think it will cause you to awaken. Because in trying to use that tool to awaken, you may be interfering with the very benefit you're trying to get. Because like if you went into a dark and quiet room going, this will help me fall asleep, you just sit there and I can't fall asleep. And the longer you can't fall asleep, the more you struggle with trying to fall asleep. And practices are that way. I mean, I know meditators that have meditated 40 years that still haven't awakened, and they're like, well, why? I've put in 40 years. I meditate so many hours a day. I go to retreats. I look at my roster of past experience. And I'm like, well, that's part of the problem. You're pushing too hard. You're trying to use this as a vehicle to awaken. And that's why I like some of the old Zen masters, because a lot of the Zen masters will say, well, you should meditate without purpose. Well, if you ever try to do a spiritual practice without purpose, that will, I think, would automatically make it all the more powerful. If you're just being present, simply to be present, if you're meditating simply to sit and not do anything, to be aware, just to be aware, not trying to get anywhere, that I think is far more powerful than trying to use it to cause something. And so, the way I look at practices, I'm like, well, they're just various ways of making a conducive environment. And there is no way to accumulate enough of them or accumulate enough effort or time in one or more of them in order to cause awakening. If you're trying to force it, it's like trying to force yourself asleep. It will get in its way. To a certain extent, you just got to create a conducive environment and then let it happen of itself. If it happens, great. If it doesn't, well, you're fully present. There's benefits to being fully present. If you're meditating, there's benefits to meditation. Do you really need more than that? You got to kind of let go of the expectation. Because part of this subtly is a pushing away or trying to future seek, as Eckhart Tolle would put it. That's it. A lot of these practices are just future seeking. I don't want to be here and now. It's what I want isn't here and now. What I want is over there. And so I'm practicing to get there and those benefits. And as long as you have that mindset, you're really never as present as you could be. You have to let all that future go and go, I'm just here. And that is good enough. I'm going to go as deeply as possible and just being here and now. And so, yeah, it's a different way of looking at practices. So, I mean, I know there's different forms of non-duality these days. I don't quite understand all the distinctions, but as far as I can tell, radical non-duality is a subset that totally wants to say all practices are pointless. Advaita Vedanta, the classical Advaita Vedanta says, well, these are the practices you should do that will cause it. Everybody's got their own take, but I would just say, pick the practices that resonate well with you and just do them for their own sake, not to get somewhere. It's, if you want to practice detachment, if that resonates with you, great, but just don't think it's going to cause anything. If you want to meditate, great, but don't think it's going to cause enlightenment. Give up that future and just be with the practice. And that, I think, is the better standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. And I heard from one teacher of mine, and he set the example that, like, say the aspiration of the enlightenment, like, creating a strong aspiration for enlightenment and then releasing that's great, because it kind of acts like a vacuum or a magnet that pulls someone, but only if it's completely released. Does that resonate with you, or what's your take?
Release is always, I would say, important. To a certain extent, some people really want to pursue enlightenment, in which case that's their aspiration. And some teachings will say, well, you got to make that your foremost desire or aspiration for it to have any effect. Then you won't get distracted. And yeah, there's some truth to that. But I like what that teacher suggested is, you can have the aspiration, but then you got to let it go. Because if you're too stuck on clinging onto the aspiration and hoping it'll get you somewhere, it will eventually become its own obstacle. So yeah, the release is vital. Just relaxing and being still and silent is a vital thing.
Mm, beautiful, beautiful. And you also host in-person satsangs in your home in St. Petersburg. Um, can you describe any kind of memorable moments at your satsangs or transformations you've witnessed or held space for during these gatherings?
Um, I haven't held one in quite some time. Right now it's rather sporadic. I mean, I've got a Facebook group, um, you know, St. Petersburg Non-Duality satsang, and I post events there, but it's pretty rare now. It's maybe once a quarter. um, because like a lot of times, the non-duality community really isn't that large, and a lot of them are very, I would say, very individualistic in that they have their own paths and they don't want interference from anybody else. It's kind of I would say, a chronic thing you see among the non-duality community is, this is my thing. I follow this teacher or this teaching. I don't want to hear anything else. And so you don't see a lot of big gatherings of non-duality satsangs, except for maybe in California or Colorado. Um, but the ones I've held here, it's been mostly people just wanting to learn about non-duality or talk about some aspect that they didn't understand. I mean, I would say that probably one of the more transformational moments was, I had this satsang. It was half a dozen people there at the time, and this woman was describing how she had kind of a satori or awakening moment. I don't know if I'd call it full-blown enlightenment, but because she still had deep suffering in life, so but there was a glimpse. There definitely was kind of a glimpse, and she was having, I guess, kind of her mind kind of kicked in and was, what's next? Is there something more? Instead of just allowing herself to abide in what she realized, which could actually lead to the full-blown awakening potentially, because it's more conducive to just abide in that realization that she had. Her mind was kicking in, trying to go, what's new? What's more? Is there something more? Is it just this? And she was describing the situation is literally, she goes, isn't there anything more? Is it just this? And I kind of looked at her and I go, isn't this enough? And she was just kind of shocked for a second. And she split a big grin, just started laughing. Mm. And she's like, yeah, this would be enough. I don't know why I need more. And, it snapped her out of the mental conditioning of always striving for more, craving for more. What else? She kind of snapped out of it and went, oh yeah, I don't need more than this. I can just abide in this. This is fine. And so, yeah, I mean, there's always those kind of little moments where people are finding themselves stuck, and then suddenly they find themselves unstuck, trying to figure out why they were stuck in the first place. Because there was nothing really holding them there. It was just her own mind was wrapping her up in this, and some conceptual thing that suddenly she felt stuck, and that, and she was able to kind of get out of it and go, why was I stuck? This is perfectly fine. And so, yeah, those kind of moments, they happen, and it's fun when it happens.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I loved hearing that story. Isn't that enough? Yeah, I love it.
Well, yeah, that sometimes happens with people when they become very, very present too. They'll get very, very present, and then they're like, well, isn't there something more than this? And I'm like, what more do you need? Isn't this enough? It's what is. Yes. Of course, if that doesn't satisfy, I sometimes will say, well, perhaps you're level of perception is still too shallow. If you're looking on a very shallow level, it doesn't look like there's much there. It's kind of like, looking at something at a, too far away where it becomes rather drab almost. But as you get very, very close, you're like, holy crap, the detail, you just didn't notice the detail until you looked at it more closely. And so there's this level of perception where sometimes I think people get stuck in the, well, isn't there more than this? I'm like, well, if you look more closer, there's more to see. So there's always more, in this ever new moment with more data that available than we could ever possibly process. There's always more. And so, the now is quite enough for those that can really get into that. But sometimes it requires overcoming some of that conditioning of craving more, something else, but also getting past a superficial level of perception that we're sometimes get stuck on because we've become habitualized to move on very quickly, look at things very shallowly and cursory, and then move on to the next thing. It's kind of like if you saw a tree and you see a tree and immediately people will almost label it immediately. It's a tree, and then stop looking at it. It's an unknown quantity. I don't need to look at it. And then they go, is there anything more? I'm like, well, did you notice anything about that tree? Was it particularly healthy? Did it have any interesting characteristics? Because that tree is unlike any other tree you've ever seen in your life. But did you notice the difference? And some people go, oh, no, I didn't notice the difference. It seemed like any other tree. I'm like, well, then you're not looking very closely.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And speaking about like folks kind of looking for the next thing or hopping from thing to thing, like considering the medium of which a lot of these teachings are being shared, which is the internet, how has the digital format influenced the way you share and people receive teachings on duality compared to some of the traditional methods like books or in-person satsangs?
Well, the digital format is just more widely, distributed, more widely available. Because although I would say as mediums go, I prefer in person the best. There's a certain exchange that can happen much more deeply in person than any other. I mean, we all know this if we really look at the various mediums. I mean, if you read a book by Eckhart Tolle, yeah, it's great and all, but he's got such a dry humor, and with his sometimes he pantomimes certain things to emphasize the joke. Unless you saw a video of him, you wouldn't realize what's going on. You would just read the text. You wouldn't have the context.
In context.
Yeah, so you just have the text, not the context of with his, dry humor, the way he pantomimes or does things. And so I think it's quite obvious to anybody that looks, well, there's far more information available from video than it is from just purely in audio, which also is superior to purely text. Because when you go from text to audio, you get audio inflection. When you go to video, you then see the person. Well, when the person's in front of you, there's also a deeper amount of information transfer. And so in terms of my favorite medium, it would be in person, because that's where the deepest sharing can happen. But the digital, video medium is pretty good, more widely distributed, because I might hold an in-person satsang. And well, if I add all the people that have ever come to my in-person satsangs for the past over 15 years, it might be a couple hundred people, maybe. But the YouTube channel's got thousands of subscribers. And so the digital format is just easier to get a hold, for people to see. And it's easier for people to get a hold of, because, if you do it in person, unless people flew to you, it's only the local people are going to see you. unless you travel around where they can see you. And only in certain circumstances would you be able to travel around to just see people and lecture. I mean, that's not something everybody can do. And so, yeah, I would say the digital format suits me well because, it's people can see it far more easily, but I do prefer the in-person if possible.
Yeah, totally. And one thing you mentioned was that, like, as you go up, like, from text to audio to then video to being in person, like the bandwidth of what can be communicated through like energy or inflection of the voice, or like the dry humor in Eckhart Tolle's example.
Yep.
So like, how does that also affect your opinion, experience, or thoughts on like almost like the energy transmission between different mediums, like just like that's that subtle amount or that shift or that space that can be held when working with somebody who has different attainments or non-attainments, if you will.
Well, the thing is if it's in person, you can create a much more immersive experience. I mean, whether they're enlightened or not doesn't matter. I mean, I've known people over the years who lectured in very spiritual subjects, and they didn't claim to be enlightened, and actually it wasn't even their cup of tea, so they probably weren't. But their in-person presentations were spectacular. So I mean, there can be a certain energy in the room that can be created either consciously or unconsciously for participants. I don't think any of that's a particularly a sign of enlightenment or anything. So it's not like if you go to the presence of an enlightened person, you will know. That's not necessarily true. I mean, there's many a person who visited Ramana Maharshi and just thought he was an interesting old dude. You know, they thought nothing of it. And I know that among some of the traditions and teachings and teachers, they'll say, well, that's because you got to be mature enough to recognize them. I think that's a bit of a cop-out. That it really is. Some people can create an atmosphere, and even if you create an atmosphere, it may or may not be perceived. And there can be other people that aren't trying to intentionally, create an atmosphere that people will pick up things. Now, this is a bit in kind of a middle ground, but there was a documentary once called Kumare, and he was an Indian American, I believe, Indian American filmmaker. And after he got out of college, he decided to do a documentary film where he made himself into a guru. He adopted his grandmother's accent. He had donned the appropriate attire, grown his hair, did the whole shebang. And a lot of his lectures, he would start by saying, I'm not enlightened. I don't have anything to teach. And then he would go on to his lecture. And over the course of weeks and months, he acquired a following. And in his core followers, they were so convinced they could feel something in his presence. And he wasn't trying to create a presence, but they like, oh yeah, he's definitely enlightened. I can just feel it when he walks into the room. He's got superpowers or whatever. All these various things they would talk about. And off camera, he'd be like, I have no idea what they're talking about. I'm not doing anything here. and that just shows that there's a power that we have within our own minds and consciousness where, if people check off enough of the boxes for who we would deem someone who's enlightened, you're going to feel like they're enlightened, because they checked off all the boxes for you. And so you're going to feel an aura or a presence or whatever. And so I've always been somewhat, I would say somewhat against the idea of having the idea of an energy transfer, the whole idea of Shakti Put and all this other stuff. You don't want to get caught up in thinking that you can get something from outside of yourself. However, At the same time, when you're trying to just create a conducive environment, sitting in silence with someone who can be deeply silent has quite a bit of value in creating a more conducive environment. Because if you've ever meditated in a group, like way back at the beginning of my spiritual journey, I used to meditate in this weekly meditation group. They would often do very love, heart-centered meditations. And I loved going to the weekly meditations just because it felt so different in a group as opposed to alone. It was like their years of meditation just kind of dragged me along a little bit. You know, I was able to meditate more deeply with them than I was alone. And in that way, if someone can be very, very silent, they can perhaps influence you just through the atmosphere of becoming more silent. And I've had some people mention that in my years at satsangs, because I often have a meditation in my satsangs, one or two of them. And, I've had people go after a meditation. Matter of fact, I remember this one satsang I had. I started the satsang with like a 15-minute meditation and then went to questions. And so we did like a 15-minute meditation. And at the end, I'm like, anyone have any questions they want to start with? And there was just dead silence. And after about another minute passed, I go, anything at all? And they're like, and somebody goes, I'm not thinking at all. Nothing's coming to mind. They just kind of really settled into being silent. And so, you get one or two people that can cease thinking and be deeply silent. It kind of helps others as they're sitting in silence to settle down. So I think there is some beneficial environment that way. But at the same time, you don't want to grasp on it too much and think that, that you'll know an enlightened one by their aura, or notice them when they come into the room, or you must have a Shaktiput or some energy, otherwise you can't become enlightened. Those are all, I think, incorrect. So, I mean, it's more of, it can help create a little bit more conducive environment at its best. And at its worst, it creates a form of dependency and becomes a hurdle. Because you also have what's called satsang junkies. And they love hopping from satsang to satsang because they get in the environment of it, and they're able to settle, or they get a euphoric feeling or whatever they get because they're in that atmosphere, and they can't get it otherwise. And so they think, well, I gotta be here because I'm getting it from them and I can't do it on my own, which is a horrible misunderstanding. It's there's nothing you can't get anywhere else. I mean, it's kind of funny that, if you think about it in terms of non-duality, when Ramana Maharshi was on his deathbed and everybody's wailing, and they go, well, they tell me I'm dying, but where would I go? I'm here. I mean, he was pointing out, I'm here, I'm ever here, but it's an everywhere here. And so there's been, I think he even mentioned to somebody during one of his correspondence, but they said, well, I'm over in the US. And he goes, it doesn't matter where you are. I'm here. Wherever you are, you can tap into that same feeling. You don't necessarily need the satsang. And so you don't want to become dependent on the environment, or, making it a crutch is a bad thing, because if you use crutches, if a healthy person uses crutches, those muscles get weaker, and then you disable yourself. And so, I think it's so when people, when you bring up that kind of topic, I'm like, ooh, that topic is a touchy one to talk about, because I don't want to say there's nothing to it, but at the same time, I don't want to put too much effort into saying there's something to it. Otherwise people grasp on that.
Yeah, it's a very fine balance to talk about things like, oh, there can be benefit to this, but here's the threshold, or, because you can't, there's nothing explicit. People have to figure out on their own what best serves them on their path and what doesn't. But there's tools, but then there's a time to let go of tools.
Yeah. Well, there's always an at best, at worst scenario with most things. Because, I mean, people will talk about, Even when they go, what, well, is a guru required? I'm like, no, it's not required. But at best, one could help. And at worst, it's not good. So it's one of those things. There's always an at best, at worst when it comes to practices or things like that. And so I think it's always, to a certain extent, I've always tried to avoid the worst case scenarios. It's like you don't want to become dependent on this stuff or think it's outside yourself, because really the whole it's contrary to the whole philosophy and idea of non-duality. I mean, non-duality is there's no other. Well, if there's no other, it's already here. It's all already here. There is no need to go there for anything. There's no need to go see this person for anything. It's all right here. It's always been right here. And so I would, on the one hand, I don't want to say there's no benefit because you can create a more conducive environment. But on the other hand, I don't want to overshadow the fact in any way. It's all right here already. You don't need anything outside yourself. And if you think you need something outside yourself, you're already hobbling yourself to a certain extent.
Yeah. Yeah. And speaking of that, like in the journey of sharing and exploring non-duality publicly, what are some of the more challenging concepts or misconceptions you've encountered from like audience members, coaching clients, and how do you address them?
Well, there's been a lot of misconceptions and things like that, but I would say, for people that don't really understand non-duality, is things like they think non-duality is something other than this, right now. I've had some people go, well, no, non-duality is some other consciousness or level. There are no sense objects, or the world disappears, or I don't know all the different stories I've heard, but the thing is if there is no other and there's only non-duality, it would have to be this. This is already non-duality. So then where does the duality come in? I go, well, the duality comes in from the divisive mind, where we're arbitrarily dividing up that which is not divided. It's kind of like, there's a quaking aspen forest called the Pando in Utah. And if somebody saw a picture of it or was there, and you go, how many trees do you see? They go, oh, there's hundreds, if not thousands, acres and acres of trees. Well, that's true if you just go by the sensual experience. If you're looking at all these trees and you think they're all individual, yeah, that kind of makes sense. However, science has found that it's a single root system. It's a clonal colony. It's like branches sticking out, not individual tree trunks. And so this is actually on the list of one of the Earth's largest organisms. It's one tree, not many. And so it's because of being ignorant of the non-separation. That's basically what happens. Is the mind likes to divide, and we believe the divisions because we just don't know better. And so that's usually how I overcome the non-duality is something else. I'm like, well, no, this is non-duality. But the teachings, I don't know, there's different ways of presenting them. I think part of the misconceptions is just becoming too attached to a certain teacher or language. Because every non-duality teacher has to plant their flag in certain fundamental concepts. And like classical non-duality, or classical Advaita Vedanta is a better term, I guess, tends to go from the standpoint that there is no free will. Everything's fate, predetermined, whatever. I tend to talk from the standpoint of there is free will. There is choice. And it really, now I think the misunderstanding is overly attaching yourself to one or the other. Because from non-duality, if you really, if you think about it, whether you say everything is predetermined or this is all chosen to be as it is, it more or less leads you to the same place. The issue arises when you say, I chose this, but I did not choose that. That's the illusion. If you start picking and going, I chose this, but I didn't choose that. Well, now that's delusion. Now you're trying to say there's two. But if you say it's all chosen or all choice, it really doesn't matter. It leads you to the same place. It's a matter of preference. And so, I prefer to talk about free will and choice, predominantly because I found that in non-duality circles these days, they get very, very heady, and it's like they become dry, almost too aloof. They become disengaged. And so if you go from the standpoint of everything's predetermined and clockwork, yeah, it can feel very dry, very, very, stale. But if you go from the standpoint of their free will and there's choice, it's a much more engaged way of living. And so for that reason, I tend to go that direction, is for the engagement side. But there's a lot of these standpoints. I mean, it's been a matter of debate, and the majority of classical Advaita Vedanta says the world is illusion and doesn't really exist. But there are aspects of Advaita Vedanta and other non-duality teachers that will say, no, the world exists. And so these are just flags we're planting. But it really comes down to the conventions of speech and what we really mean by the term. And so I'd say a lot of the misconceptions come into being overly attached to the terms we use, and perhaps not asking the teacher or speaker the question, what do you really mean by whatever term they're using? Because, which is why on my channel, I try to initially define things like enlightenment and, what is suffering and things like that. Because without defining your terms, you're really kind of assuming a lot of things. And so, because there's a classic battle, I guess, it's brought up by many people, but they'll say, well, Advaita Vedanta and Hinduism in particular will say there's an Atman. And then Buddhism says an Atman. So they're in contrast to each other. Which one's right? And I'm like, well, you didn't, if you look at what the Buddha said, what he meant by an Atman, he basically said there's no personal me, there's no unchanging, everlasting me. That's all he's saying. Now, the self in Advaita Vedanta is not personal. So it's not contrary. But if you somehow believe that the Atman is personal, then it would appear to be contrary. And that's why in Hinduism they usually talk about jiva. Jiva is the personal aspect. It's the living being aspect. And they'll try to divide the nomenclature to try to make distinctions. But Atman's a impersonal ultimate reality. Atman is Brahman, is what they'll say. And so from that standpoint, there's no real fight between Hinduism and Buddhism. And so that's where a lot of the misconceptions come in. Is we come in with these beliefs, we hear these teachers, and we're like, they meant this. Do you really know they meant this? Did you ask them? Or are you just going off of your understanding of it? Because, some people will very much argue that Hinduism and Buddhism cannot ever meet. They are opposed to each other, even after you explain the fact that there is no personal aspect to Atman. And so I think that's where a lot of the issues rise, is just the context, the meaning. We need to start asking people to define their terms.
Yeah, I think with defining terms, that makes so much sense too, because even for a simple word, like if we just pull up the word peace, and if there's an audience, we ask them, hey, pull up 3 words that you associate with the word peace to describe it. We pulled an audience together, they would come up with completely different words or vernacular to come to those terms. There might be some crossover, but for the most part, everyone would have a very unique circumstance with one word. So then what happens if we have sentences or paragraphs, or we have books and whole schools of philosophy? I can see how there's a lot of convolution and trickiness and that.
And then when you're translating from one language to the other, sometimes there aren't English equivalents of those words and vice versa. Or sometimes the English word or vice versa is very vague compared to the other language. And so when you start transferring languages, it gets even worse. But I mean, it's kind of funny because you'll have some people under misconceptions like, well, I hear you talk about me and I, as if after enlightenment you're not allowed to use those pronouns anymore. And I'm like, well, no, those are just conventions of speech. It's just easier to use those words. But if somebody was to say, what do you mean by I and me when you're talking? I would say, well, I'm referring to the body. If I go to the store, I'm saying the body's going to the store. If I'm going to sleep, I'm going to work, whatever. I'm hungry. I'm talking about the body. That's not an identity. And so, there are these distinctions where, and that will vary depending on teacher to teacher or speaker to speaker. Is they may be using the words in a slightly different way. And people get very caught up in their words and they want to say, well, you said this, therefore it proves this. And it's like, well, no. In what context? How are you using that word? That's the important part.
And so I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about some of your offerings or upcoming projects or topics related to non-duality or your YouTube channel, coaching, spirituality that you may be excited about exploring or sharing with your audience.
Well, my YouTube channel has been around for many years. It's about one video a week currently. For a while there, I was doing 2 videos a week. Got kind of burnt out, so I'm done about one video a week. But the YouTube channel is still going. Non-Duality and Enlightenment Simplified. Also through non-dualitysimplified.com, my website, I've got pretty much everything I've ever written or done. So I've got my old blog, my old audio podcasts, cartoons I've written, everything. But on the website, I also mentioned I do one-on-ones. And so for those that want to do a one-on-one, it's just a matter of filling out the form and saying, hey, this time and day would typically work best for me. You just pick a day, say the March, May 1st or whatever, and then just pick a time, Eastern time. And then I would just start the email conversation from there on setting it up. I do them on a pretty much a gift format. So it's like whatever you want to donate, whatever you thought it was worth. I don't really charge a flat fee. I'm currently between jobs. My contract ended a while ago, so I'm pretty available when it comes to time. So I mean, during the weekdays I can do now. Down the road I may not be able to do weekdays during the day because I'll be working, but I can now. But I usually do a lot of one-on-ones on weekends and on nights and weekends. Other than that, the St. Petersburg Non-Duality South Song, if I do an in-person South Song, it'll be listed there. It would also be listed there if I did a virtual one, which I haven't done in a long time, but I might. But that's kind of what I have to offer at the moment.
Beautiful, and thank you so much for sharing and being on the show today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a blast.
It's been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you much.